According to textbook biology, the gap in time between a chimpanzee and a human is how long? About 5 million years. The transition from an ancestor that looked, this wolf-like, deer-like, putative progenitor to a fully aquatic cetacean was roughly a window of time of about what? 7 to 8 million years. So in the time, supposedly, that it took for a chimpanzee or chimp-like ancestor to become truly a hominid, you have this transition from an aquatic mammal to one that's from a terrestrial mammal to one that's fully aquatic. But what's happened in the past few years is that this window of time has become very narrow. It was thought in 2001 that there was anywhere from 9 to 11 million years. We now know that this gap here between a terrestrial mammal, a putative ancestor of whales, to a fully marine cetacean was around 1 to 2 million years, at most around 3 million years. Now, what does this mean in engineering terms? When you look at the first cetaceans, the first aquatic whales, truly aquatic, giving birth in the sea, nursing their young in the ocean, completing their whole life cycle in an oceanic environment, and you compare their anatomy, their soft part, their hard part anatomy, to that of, say, the putative ancestor, you're not talking about 3 changes or 5 changes or 10 changes. It's not like you take a cow, cut off the leg, shave it, throw it into the ocean and say, okay, go out there and the best to you. You need a number of profound systemic transitions. And here are just a few of them. You need, for example, an ability to move a tail flute up and down in the water. You need a special backbone modification, a special bone called the ball vertebra. You need blubber for temperature insulation. If you're a whale and you need to dive down, say, 2,000 feet, 5,000 feet in a matter of minutes, then you need some means of adjusting for that. You need the ability to drink seawater, changes in kidneys. You need the ability to conduct labor underwater. You need to reduce the hind limbs. You need to transform the forelimbs. It's on and on and on. It's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of engineering changes that had to have occurred. And they had to have occurred not in 50 million years, not in 100 million years, not even within 10 million years, but within a very narrow window of time. And here's just a few more examples that I will not belabor. But the question is, and it's the one question that I want to address tonight, is can this geological pattern, this progression of forms, be explained by the textbook processes of population genetics? That's code for neo-Darwinian theory. Does neo-Darwinism, as it exists today, provide an adequate causal explanation for the origin of these new organ systems? Now, according to the theory, what you need for evolution to occur, any type of evolution, is you need mutations, you've got to have variation, you've got to have selection, a sieving process, and therefore, if you need new traits, and the more you need, the more mutations you have to have. It's grist for the mill of evolution. So, how do we judge whether or not the theory works? Well, by its own standard, and that is the equations of population genetics. It's a numbers game. You essentially need 3 things. In order to get enough mutations, for you to take, say, a domestic dog and to transform it into some other kind of animal, you need either many generations of selective breeding, you need a lot of mutations coming in, a lot of variability that you can select, or you need immense population sizes. And then, once you find those few odd variants that fit the bill, it's not just enough for them to appear. They have to become fixed in a population. They have to become the dominant trait that you find throughout the lineage. It's like dog breeding. You select a certain breed, you pick a trait, and you don't just want, I've got this one trait and I'm now going to let it breed with any mongrel that comes along. No, what you do is you carefully cultivate it so that you end up with a type that breeds true. It's the same idea in neo-Darwinian theory. If you don't have any of those three things, then you have a problem with variation being exhausted, you don't have any grist for the mill, or you have what's called genetic drift, and all that means is simply that the whole process is willy-nilly. It's random, it's haphazard. And what I want to think about is the kind of changes, with this in mind, the kind of changes that would take you from this kind of animal, as cartoonish as it is, to this kind of animal, Basilosaurus. Remember, this transition was only a few million years. Now, I want to show you something, a very remarkable innovation that cetacea have. I just want you to think about how you would engineer this. And I also want you to think about it from the standpoint of irreducible complexity. Cetacea do not have the male reproductive organs on the outside of the body. The testes are on the inside. And they're right next to the muscle systems that generate heat during swimming. What they have is a cooling system, though. You know what happens, for example, in humans or dogs, if the testes do not descend? What happens? Sterility. And that is because sperm production requires a lower core body temperature than what you have in most mammals. What they have is a system where they shunt cold blood, or cool blood, from the tail flukes, from the dorsal fin, and they bathe the testes in this cooled blood. That in turn takes the heat and then it's dispersed throughout the cardiovascular system. So even though they're swimming and they're generating a lot of heat, the core temperature of that organ is actually below body temperature. Now the problem to think about here is, which comes first? You need actually both systems in order to have reproductive viability, or at least at first blush you do. So, how easy is, let's imagine, let me just step back for a second, just a few more slides, so please bear with me. But imagine that you need only 2 changes to DNA to build this system. Let's just imagine, all you needed 2 mutations. And you go from having the standard terrestrial type male reproductive apparatus to having a whale reproductive apparatus. It's an outrageous stretch, I know, but let's just imagine, let's just suppose. And you'd say, well, who's done that calculation? Well, in 2008, in a peer-reviewed journal called Genetics, 2 authors, Darwin and Schmidt, attempted to refute Michael Behe, and they looked at this problem within mammals and within fruit flies and some other groups. And the question that they asked was very simple. They said, how long would it take for 2 of these coordinated changes to appear in a population? And they said, well, of course, Behe's wrong, because we know that in our lineage, we're mammals, it would take, you would see these 2 coordinated changes appear every 216 million years. Now, what's the problem with that figure? The problem is, you only have 5.5 million years. You don't have 216 million years. But if you take their figures and you adjust it to what you would have if you were talking about some prehistoric whale, some proto-whale, existing cows, any kind of hippopotami, it doesn't matter what group you're talking about, and you ramp it down, what this corresponds to in whale time is it would take for 2 such changes 43 million years or so. But again, you have a problem. And what's that problem? You only had a few million years. And again, we're talking about a very complex system, but all that's being presupposed is that 2 simple changes to DNA is going to be able to build that. Now, it could be argued, and here's just a paper, if anyone wants to cite it, Genetics 2008, it's open access. Anyone can go and they can retrieve this paper, they can look at the math, and it's one of the first papers to really tackle the subject. Believe it or not, it hasn't been tackled until just the past few years. And here's just going documentation of their math. So there are 3 problems, though. The problem is that when we look at it, there were too few generations involved in the transition from a so-called walking whale to a fully aquatic whale. The numbers of mutations needed are prohibitive. And we know, though, that unlike bacteria, unlike viruses, unlike fruit flies, mammalian breeding population sizes are actually quite low. Take rats, for example. You would think, well, they're millions, if not billions of rats worldwide, but yet breeding population, there are only about 100,000, 400,000 or so breeding at any one time. So the nub of the issue is there was not enough time, and I'm just going to skip over that lengthy slide. The problem, though, with the Darwin-Schmidt model, if it is a problem, this, remember, 2 DNA changes will give you this elaborate engineering marvel, is that they presuppose that the first change caused a slight decrease in function. You lose something, and then you've got to rely on the second change to get the system up and running. But what if you say, I'm going to grant that you don't need any of that, that there was no cost at all, period, to the evolutionary process, that it was completely neutral. So let's suppose that, and I'll show you the model, that what you have is you've got a free gene floating, if you will, in the gene pool, ready to evolve, that you need anywhere from 1 to 10 neutral, that is, will have no effect if you make the change, could have a positive effect, but there's no cost to making the change within a period of time, and that we're going to have a breeding population size, prehistoric whales that are roughly what we know of not existing whales, but let's say human populations or cows, what have you. And let's rerun it. In other words, let's grant to the theory everything that it wants to reify the theory, if you will. And here's what you find. This is a strictly neutral model. What you're saying is that, okay, here are the number of mutations to come up with that engineering marvel. Here are the number of generations needed to get, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what you find is that given that extra gene and given just a few changes, really by the time that you get to 2 to 3 mutations, you've already exceeded the amount of time available. So if you assume that in making this, like building a ship at sea, you've got to tear the ship apart, but nevertheless you're out in the ocean and then you've got to rebuild it, if you assume that that's not going to cause any engineering problems, everything's going to go along, no pun intended, swimmingly, nevertheless, you run into this time problem. This is a problem that is quite severe. And this is a problem that is entailed by the equations themselves. It falls out of the math. And here's the nub of the issue again. That if you grant a strictly neutral process, no cost, and it would typically need only 2 or more mutations in a duplicate, before you get an adaptive novelty, before you get that cooling system for the reproductive, then there simply were not enough generations or years for this to happen. The problem is that when we look at the DNA sequences of these different types of mammals, and we look at the changes required for new functionality, and this is what Dr. Doug Axe is going to be speaking about in particular, what you find is that you need far more than 4 changes. In other words, the last point is that you need too many engineering modifications to be made, but you have too little time. And that's my point, and I will hand it over to Steve. Thank you.
I think it's very subversive of Dr. Sternberg to use such a sexy example on a college campus. When he first went through the series of all the anatomical changes, I thought, oh, we'll talk about the whale. But he got there. Okay. One point of clarification, when he was talking about the Darwin-Schmidt paper, the context is important here because they were trying to make a calculation of how long it would take for 2 coordinated mutations to occur in service of a common function. Michael Behe had made a calculation of that sort based on studies of malarial bacteria, and had come up with a very big, scary number. I think it was 500 million or maybe even more, maybe it was something like 1 billion, I can't remember. And so they came back and said, no, Behe is wrong. it would only be 216 million, which is equally prohibitive.